Hey everyone, this is Alex and Ben. Welcome back to another episode of the Oregon Bridge.
You know, I really believe that the world is this, each state is an incredible experiment on how to run government, how to run economic policy. And I think it's important to look at which countries are doing well, which countries are succeeding. And everyone always talks about how incredible America is. And it is. I believe this is the greatest country in the world. But at the same time, we also have to understand that 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. We do have a lot of issues that need to be dealt with, but I see unlimited potential. We just need good leaders to step up and help try and take us there.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We are really excited today to bring you Jimmy Crumpacker. And you may know Jimmy Crumpacker as the Trumpbacker, who ran in the 2nd Congressional District last time around. Jimmy is a 7th generation Oregonian, which we talk a little bit about in the episode. And he spent some time in Washington, D.C. and worked on Wall Street for a number of years before moving back to Oregon and managing his own investments here. He's also been involved in a number of community organizations such as Meals on Wheels and the Portland Japanese Garden, and as well as the Oregon Ballet. So Ben, how'd you think the episode went?
So I'm going to start by saying this. Jimmy Crumpacker had the greatest distance between what I thought the interview was going to go like versus what the interview actually went like of any of our guests. I was most surprised by Jimmy of any of our guests. He is deeply intelligent. He reads The Economist cover to cover and speaks as though he does. We spent a lot of time talking about geopolitics at the beginning, which we were supposed to be talking about his personal background, and we took some turns. But the conversation was fascinating. Alex got the first ever cryptocurrency question in on the Oregon Bridge pod, so kudos to Alex. We talked about China in a way that we've been trying to talk about China for a long time, and we actually got there in this one. And we spent some time talking about investments and state investments and the politics of making decisions about maximizing profits, gains for investors / taxpayers / retirees versus trying to use investments as a means to achieve some other ends, a social or political ends, which I thought all of that was fascinating. But yeah, I thought it was a deeply interesting interview and was glad that we got to talk to him. Alex, what do you make about his run for the new 5th CD?
Yeah, it was a really interesting episode, and he clearly has some real policy chops. And we really grilled him from Bitcoin, international capital flows, to inflation, to energy, to various conservative, more focused issues, race and justice. So yeah, he really went through the full ringer. And I think, especially for a lot of our Democratic listeners, the 5th Congressional District Democratic primary is going to be super fascinating because you have political heavyweight Curt Schrader versus Jamie McLeod Skinner, who is obviously a political heavyweight in her own right. And then on the GOP side of things, you're going to have Jimmy, who I think people will be impressed just by listening to the episode, versus Lori Chavez DeRemer, who our pod listeners also know very well, who's been on either 2 or 3 times now. So the 5th Congressional District is easily going to make national news, both in the primary as well as in the general. And it would not surprise me if groups already started spending money just on the primary election alone, just trying to basically edge out who they think will be the best candidate. So really interesting episode, though. I was really glad we could have him on. And yeah, that was... hope everybody enjoys listening, and please make sure to subscribe and hit the 5 stars button as well if your platform so allows it. And definitely check us out on YouTube. Jimmy did not get to show his French bulldog, which he said that he was babysitting, but Ben and I got to see it at the end, and it was very cute. So
yes, it was. All right, everybody, we really appreciate your support of the podcast. And if you're listening to, I guess this will come out sometime after the holidays, maybe just before the new year or just after, but either way, we hope that you've enjoyed the holiday season. And here's hoping 2022 is better for all of us than 2021. Enjoy the episode.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Oregon Bridge. We are excited to bring you this holiday episode, which is pretty close to the holidays. And today we have Jimmy Crumpacker. Jimmy, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Merry Christmas, happy holidays. All is well. Although I have to admit, I'm a little disappointed in my fantasy football team because I think I'm going to lose in the playoffs right now, which is a major bummer. But
Yeah, I've
it
actually,
happens.
yeah, I'm in the Oregon GOP league.
No
I
way.
started the season either 4-0 or 5-0, and when I checked last, I was 4-6. So
Oh, dear.
I don't know what type of corruption and rig has happened in this league, but we need an investigation immediately.
Can you drop any names? Who's winning that league?
I'll have to check on that. It's a good question.
Okay.
I know it's definitely not Reagan.
Okay, good.
So it's someone. But yeah, Jimmy, so really happy to have you on the show. And usually I tell our guests, as I told you, I said, please don't talk about your background because of course we're going to cover that in the intro. But in breaking from tradition for this episode, I was able to find your old campaign bio from your website, which gave me a little bit of information, but I was kind of surprised of like the lack of information I was able to find, considering that you've run for Congress before and you're obviously a very successful businessman. Could you just take us a little bit, like give us a little bit about your personal background? I know that you're a 7th generation Oregonian. We know you went to Georgetown and were in DC, spent some time there. Give us your full background.
Sure. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate the opportunity. I am 7th generation Oregonian. Our family came out about 170 years ago, and were established actually down in Jacksonville in the Medford area. I was born to two parents that met when they were, probably 5 and 3 years old. They went to the same public school, same school that I went to. And then, yes, I went to the East Coast for school, went to Georgetown University where I studied government, and was actually an intern for Gordon Smith back in 2001, spring of 2001, which was a great time to be an intern, although it's not a very interesting job. You basically are just opening letters and giving tours. So, but you get an idea in a sense of the mechanics of government, but constituent letters aren't necessarily the most fascinating part of government, but a necessary one. And after, when I was at Georgetown, I thought about going right into government. But a very close friend of my mom's, who was very well established in Republican politics, told me I needed to go and get a business background, because she said, if you go straight into politics, you're not going to have a sense of how the real world works, which I think was one of the best pieces of advice I ever received. So upon graduating from Georgetown, I moved to New York City, and I started working on Wall Street. And I worked originally at AIG for a couple of years, and then I got a job on a commodity trading desk. And for until I ran for my last congressional seat in 2019, I had been trading commodities for 13 years. So from 2006 until 2019. So, and I moved back from New York after 7 years at a firm called First New York Securities, which was a prop trading shop. We basically had 250 traders, and you were given a percentage of the profits you made. It was a very challenging place to work, because over my 7 years there, we fired something like 75 people off of a desk of 12 traders, because if you lost money, they would just fire you immediately. Wow. So I was looking to leave New York. I loved New York in my 20s. Once I got into my 30s, it just wasn't, the energy level just wasn't the same. And so I wanted to get back home. So I had an opportunity to move back home, and I did that, and started a fund, and had a great run. And once I moved back home, I was able to really get involved in the community, which was really important to me. So I went very deep in a couple of different, for a couple of different organizations in the Portland metropolitan area, and did that. And then I moved to Bend in 2019 and ran for Congress. So that's the quick and dirty of it.
Great. And we will talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but there is one personal interest question that I have to ask you, because I just got done reading the Bitcoin Billionaires book by Ben Mesrick, which is about the Winklevoss twins. And I had read an article that they which they coined as celebrity donors, which I thought was pretty fun. And the book, I don't know if you've read the book, it's pretty biased towards the Winklevoss twins, but I mean, they do seem like incredibly intelligent and nice guys. And obviously, I mean, I think they're both worth like $5 or $6 billion each now. How do you know the Winklevoss twins? What's the background there?
Great story. And I actually have read the book. They actually sent me a signed copy, which was very generous.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
And actually, just for context for viewers real quick, the Winklevoss twins were the other co-founders of Facebook who got into a lawsuit with Mark Zuckerberg, basically claiming that Mark Zuckerberg had stolen their idea when they were all students at Harvard. And they received a pretty handsome payout in terms of a lawsuit, but they felt very wronged basically by Zuckerberg getting all the credit for Facebook when it was originally their idea.
Yeah. And in the movie The Social Network, I think that's probably where people would know them best from. But I actually went to college with their older sister. She went to Georgetown and was very close with one of my roommates. So got to know the twins. They are really interesting guys and obviously incredibly successful. And were very generous to my last campaign.
That's awesome.
And then a question there before I know Ben wants to jump in. Bitcoin, cryptocurrency. If you know the twins, Are you an active cryptocurrency investor yourself, or is that an area that you've considered getting into?
Yeah, no, I I hate to give financial advice on a political podcast. But, yeah, I have invested in digital currencies. I think especially now with what we're seeing in inflation and sadly kind of runaway deficits in the United States and in other central banks around the world, I think that there is a future. Now, is it going to go straight up? No. I mean, if you're going to invest in something like this, you have to be prepared for 30-40% drops in perhaps 1 month times. So I would look at it almost like the emergence of the .com market in the late 90s, where obviously companies like Amazon came out of that, but at the same time you had pets.com and you had a number of other companies that weren't very successful. So I would caution people in investing, but I think in a long term, I think it will be successful.
Kudos to Alex for the first crypto question in podcast history. And Jimmy, you might be one of the few guests who could actually give an informed answer to the question. So, so that was good.
Would not be surprised if you ran into it on the campaign trail. So
yeah, I guess, no. It's certainly rising in people's minds. So my question is about, so when you ran, and we'll get into this a little bit later, you ran as like a very conservative candidate. You were endorsed by Oregon Firearms Federation, Oregon Right to Life, National Right to Life, Susan B. Anthony list, like some very heavy hitters on the conservative side. So I was interested to hear your experience about Wall Street, working on Wall Street, which and you were very pro Donald Trump when you ran the first time. And Trump was sort of like famously anti-Wall Street in some ways. And sort of, was at least in the campaign of 16 versus I think you could quibble with how he governed and argue that perhaps that wasn't how he governed, but he ran as kind of anti-Wall Street, anti-wealthy, anti-powerful establishment, etc. So I'm curious from your perspective as someone who's kind of lived on that side of the country in those power circles and then come back to a more rural place in Oregon, how do you think about that sort of like populist appeal of Trump, like sort of running against what he calls a rigged system? And like, does that resonate with you based on the experiences that you had, or do you think that you have a different take?
Yeah, if you looked at the way that Trump talked about the markets, I mean, he was, every time the market hit a new high, he would tweet it out, right? So it seemed to me as though he was a huge cheerleader of the markets. But I understand the point that you're getting at. He definitely came at it from, hey, there's a lot of people in America are not getting the advantages that these stock markets are the high stock market valuations. And so that is a really interesting juxtaposition. So, and I agree with him with a lot of that. Obviously, there's a great section of America that is not invested at all in the stock market. So yes, although it does help raise a lot of people, and obviously someone like yourself, Ben, who is very progressive and cares about unions and teachers, the PERS system. I mean, they benefit greatly from the stock market. So, I think it is across all spectrums, but I understand what you're saying, because he was really talking about the people that have not gotten the advantages of the American economy, because everyone always talks about how incredible America is. And it is. I believe this is the greatest country in the world for many reasons. But at the same time, we also have to understand that 50% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, right? And so that is something that has a significant impact not only on Oregon, because if you go to rural Oregon, there are a lot of towns that they don't care what the price of Amazon stock is. But I think Donald Trump was really speaking to them, saying, "Hey, we need to try and lift up that portion of the economy."
So one follow-up I have I didn't prepare this, but you mentioned investments. I don't know if you saw this or if listeners saw this, but there's a controversy in the Democratic primary for governor where one candidate, I believe it was Speaker Kotek, came out and basically said the state should not be investing in fossil fuel companies. And there have been several other iterations of this where activists will say we shouldn't invest state dollars in certain areas that they find harmful in some way, in one way or another. And then the response from the state treasurer, Tobias Reed, was essentially, we have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize gains for Oregonians, for taxpayers, for PERS recipients, et cetera, who benefit from the investments. How do you think about, and there's been some calls on the right as well to boycott potential companies or countries who aren't aligned with the values of conservatives. So I wonder, given your experience, how you think about government investments and investing in potentially controversial areas?
That's a great question. Certainly there are investment practices that, if you looked at the pressure that was put on South Africa, right, with apartheid. I mean, I don't think if there hadn't been divestment, then the government would have changed, right?
Right.
But if I look at something like fossil fuels, that is something, I mean, especially as it was an area that I invested in for a long time, that I look at and I say, unfortunately, they're trying to score political points without realizing who they're hurting in the economy, right? So, and I say that because the bottom 20% of the wealth in America, right, the bottom 20 band, 29% of their post-tax earnings are spent on transportation, i.e. their car, fixing their car, and gasoline. That is an incredible amount of money that's going into transportation. And if you ban as many investment vehicles, as many endowments, if you look at the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway, which the irony is incredible because they gained all their wealth from oil drilling, divesting almost 41 trillion has been taken out of investing in hydrocarbons. And so what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is this incredible amount of divestment, which means that the Western oil companies are going to lose power, which is really not a good thing on multiple levels. Not only because the price of gasoline is going to go way up, as it has this year. It's gone up, roughly between 40 and 50%. At one point, it was 50%. But also, you're going to give a lot of power to the national oil corporations, right? So, yes, the United States is the second largest producer of oil in the world, and Canada is in the top 10, and Mexico is pretty close. But if you think about the countries that this sort of policy would benefit, Russia is the largest producer in the world. And then you're talking about Saudi Arabia, Iran, Angola, Libya, Algeria. Venezuela used to be, but unfortunately their economy is absolutely tanked after, Chavez's policies. But what allowed actually Chavez and Putin to take incredible amounts of power was that on the run-up of oil prices between 2001 and 2008, their coffers were spilling over, right? So it allowed them to take absolute power over their countries. So it's a long-winded answer to say, it's not that simple. By taking away investment in Exxon and Shell, you're actually, in my opinion, hurting the poorest Americans. because they are the most sensitive to price changes in gasoline. And you're also handing power back to national oil corporations and countries that I don't think necessarily have America's best interests at hand.
And so, Jimmy, I actually have one question in that realm before I know Ben has a question about your experience in energy investing, kind of the future of energy investing, before we get into politics and policy, which we promised we're getting there. So, and I think this actually relates to is if, you were to win this race and become a member of Congress, is there's been a lot of concern in DC, and I would say it's very bipartisan. I mean, I think Democrats are as hawkish on this issue as Republicans are. Nancy Pelosi, I think, is actually one of the most hawkish on this issue. But either U.S. companies or U.S. government entities themselves, such as pension funds, either on the state or the federal level, making investments in Chinese companies, both in the Chinese private sector and at Chinese state-owned firms. And I'm sort of curious from your perspective, because you worked on Wall Street. I don't know exactly if your firm. I imagine it probably wasn't if you're investing in energy, but like a lot of these firms, one, have led some of the investment that is both outsourced jobs to places like China, places like India, and that sort of thing. Secondly, is now they're taking pension funds, both federally and on the state level, and investing them in Chinese companies, which of course I think is bad for America and also, frankly, bad for shareholders. Because I think there's going to be problems in the future of getting that money back if tensions keep on rising. I'm kind of curious of how you approach this as an investor, probably having some experience in the space of like, do you think that the government needs to draw more firm lines in terms of allowing, international capital flows and things like that, especially as you were saying, into places like China or places into Russia, which we generally see as adversaries?
Right. That's a phenomenal question and incredibly relevant, especially if you're looking at what's been happening with the Chinese oversight of tech companies. From a personal standpoint, I would tell people to be incredibly cautious. She has been reining back. The leader of China. She has been really reining in the tech companies because he thought that they had way too much power. And so if you look at their stock prices over the last year, they have been nosediving because the Chinese, they really believe in state control of capitalism, which is not good. Basically, the state, and in my opinion, the United States should also be staying out of where people want to invest because the state is not very good at putting funds into the best places, if that makes sense. So, the Chinese are incredibly complicated. Right now, they're obviously saber rattling over Taiwan, which is a great concern. I think that could be one of the ultimate issues that the world economy faces. The Taiwanese produce 80% of the semiconductors in the world. And as you've seen with the shortage of semiconductors this year based on the pandemic, if 80% of the production gets lost, then that's a major issue. But I don't think that Xi will actually attack Taiwan because if he were to lose that battle, I think he loses power in China. And I think that that's something that at the end of the day, he cares more about than anything else. And that's why he's been going after these tech companies. Now, as far as companies like, Nike, that's a great example. Obviously, Ron Wyden's been in the news recently for kind of protecting Nike and this accusation that Nike is using the Uyghurs. And unfortunately, the situation with the Uyghurs in China is really sad. The fact that a million Uyghurs are basically in concentration camps in Western China is devastating. This is actually something I was talking about on the campaign trail 2 years ago. But I would caution the government ever making decisions about banning capital flows to countries.
Why? Why not use it as we've Titus and I have talked about the Uyghur issue several times and basically saying this demands a government response, an international response much stronger than anything we've seen. So why not use capital flow as a way to incentivize better behavior? Do you just think the cost would be too high?
I just don't see where the benefit comes. Like where shutting off what valves? That's the question I would ask you guys. And is it good for the American people to get into a tit for tat war, right? We have to realize the Chinese own trillions of dollars of our treasury bills, right? So what happens if they start selling our treasury bills? All right, so interest rates go up to 4%. Think about that for a second. You know, if interest rates are at 4% and we are dealing with a $29 trillion deficit, all of a sudden we're going to be paying trillions of dollars in just interest alone. So, you know, this is something that I think America has gotten a little too addicted at, is using the power of the dollar to punish countries. And countries like China and Russia are searching for other money to not use the dollar. And eventually this could catch up with us. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years, might not happen in the next 20 years, but it's a cautionary tale. You know, when you use the dollar as a weapon, eventually that can catch up with you.
Great. Well, Jimmy, I did not even expect we'd get into sanction policy.
I know, this is fascinating. I love this.
No, I feel like the only candidate who is not in office right now that has a position on that, which my inner DC nerd wants to dive into. But maybe we'll
sure,
transition.
I mean, there are countries that I think we should be sanctioning. So, I mean, if you want to talk about that, we could definitely get involved. So.
Okay, I'll bite. Before we transition, give us one or two countries that you think we should be sanctioning more than we already are.
Well, you know, sanctions a strong word, but, you know, clearly there are countries that don't have our best interests in hand, right? So I look at Afghanistan, for instance, which, you know, sadly, what's happened over the last 6 months there is devastating. And I think what you're going to see over the next couple of years is hopefully not, but you could see mass starvation. Right. And you are going to see a lack of education. You're already seeing, you know, women basically being taken out of the workplace, being taken out of schools. And, you know, I look at Afghanistan as a major issue. And sadly, I blame a lot of that on Pakistan, right? Because the Pakistanis and ISI, which is basically, you know, the CIA of Pakistan, they allowed a safe harbor for the Taliban and for their troops. And so, because we weren't allowed to ever go into Pakistan to attack, they could always go back there, revive, you know, and then come back at us, you know, but during the winter season. Obviously, the summer season was the fighting season. So, you know, the ISI, the generals in Pakistan, and granted, after Osama bin Laden was killed on Pakistani soil, they really did not want our help. But the amount of billions of dollars that we gave to the Pakistanis over the last 25 years is shocking. And this is not a country that I think has our best interests at hand. And is actually quite dangerous because the ISI and the generals really control the country. And Khan, who is in theory the elected leader, really isn't the one in control. And he's actually ceded more power to the generals than almost any other leader before him. And you look at like their skirmishes with India as well. I mean, that is very dangerous because we're talking about two nuclear armed countries. So, I mean, we can go on and on if you like, but you know, I care deeply about geopolitics, and I think it's something that is crucial.
I was just going to say, so, you know, obviously I read the newspaper articles about you when you ran. I think you were most known, at least in Democratic circles, for the campaign ad where, in fact, I think Titus has a question in it. I had no idea that we were going to get so into the weeds on this level. So this is my, I think it was the Sarah Palin question, where they were like, where do you get your news from? So when you're reading about geopolitics, international affairs, where are you getting this level of information? And you must just read on a daily basis about what's happening.
I read The Economist cover to cover every week.
That'll do it.
You know, yeah. No, I mean, and listen, it's one of those things where it's so dry and hard to get into. But once you get into it, once you start getting background stories on different countries, it really pieces together a very fascinating look at the world because, you know, I really believe that the world is this incredible, you know, each state is an incredible experiment on how to run government, how to run economic policy. And I think it's important to look at which countries are doing well, which countries are succeeding, and which countries are not doing well. And at the end of the day, I do believe America has been the most successful country, and basically since World War II, we've tried to keep the peace as best as possible, and especially if you look at over the last 20 years. 30% of the world's population was under the poverty line, basically living on less than $1 a day. And pre-pandemic, we got that number down to, I believe, 10%, which is remarkable. And I give the United States a lot of credit for that. But at the same time, we need to be taking care of the people in our country that are at the bottom. And that, I think, is something that unfortunately gets lost in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Great. Well, Jimmy, let's go ahead and we'll transition over to politics. And I was going to say policy. That's my line I had written, but we've gotten quite in depth into policy already. But so tell us. So Jimmy, your last run for Congress, which you ran in the 2nd district, you had a number of major endorsements. I know that you raised a bunch of money and that you ended up running a really competitive campaign. Now, you did end up falling short in the GOP primary. But before we get into your current run, what are some of the lessons that you had from last time around that you're hoping to apply for this time?
Oh, that's a great question. Ben, you ran last time, right? Am I?
Yeah. The COVID campaign.
Right. So I think you can appreciate where I'm coming from, where, I was running against, and you guys know better than I, probably the deepest, toughest field in an Oregon primary.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The former guy who'd run for governor in the last cycle, former 22-year state senator, state rep, and a 13-year state rep, state senator slash. So, I was going against some real heavyweights, and as the newcomer, it was super important for me to be out and meeting and shaking as many hands as possible. So, I literally put 10,000 miles on my car in the first month in January, because basically the campaign, my campaign didn't start till January. I didn't really even file until mid-December, I think. So, it was really hard because we were really successful on the ground. And then my last campaign event, I think, was March 13th, which was, right up against it. And so I basically spent 9 weeks on the couch. So the lesson that I learned, it's crucial to shake someone's hand. It's crucial to be in a room with someone, and we were lucky that we were able to take the lead in that race against those heavyweights. And unfortunately, once we took the lead, kind of everybody trained their fire on us. And so maybe in retrospect, if we run our ads a little bit later, that might have been more effective, giving them less time to attack us. But it was there was no playbook for the pandemic election. And as a younger guy like Ben, we need to be out there. When you're going against established politicians that people know, it's very hard to combat that advantage that they have.
Yeah, that is very similar to my thesis on, first of all, like getting a message to penetrate that wasn't related to COVID was impossible. Like it was the only, and there was also this, and I don't know if this was in the 2nd district, but definitely in more progressive districts, like this sense of like, you want to talk about something other than COVID? Have you no sense of decency? Like COVID is the issue. People are dying. People were scared. So the reasons why you were running in the first place were challenging to actually communicate because people didn't want to hear them. And then, my version of being in the room or shaking someone's hand was like doors, which I guess is harder in the 2nd congressional district. But like primary campaigns on the Democratic side or actually, I guess on the Republican side, we had Senator Tim Knope on one of our recent episodes, and he was talking about how in his first run for office, he, what did he say, Alex? He knocked on half the doors in the district and he lost.
He got a little over half the vote.
And he got a little over half the vote. So the lesson was basically you have to knock on every door. So I definitely identify with those lessons learned from the last campaign.
Well, yeah, and you bring up a phenomenal point. The number one story that has ever been written about, published in world history was the COVID-19 pandemic. So getting oxygen, nobody wanted to even, cover this. And this should have been one of the biggest races in Oregon history, right? I mean, we had three heavyweights. We had me in the race who raised significant funds. And getting a newspaper article or even, footage on the nightly news, on a local news channel, was non-existent. And I don't blame it. I mean, everybody thought it was the Spanish flu, right? Everyone was saying 25 million deaths. And, so there was unfortunately just not enough information. And I think that the voters at the end of the day, they said, hey, we know Cliff Bentz, he's a trusted hand, and in a situation where there was so much unknown, I think he was the play that most voters went with. So,
well, so that brings us to today. You decided that you haven't had enough punishment. You need to throw yourself in another congressional race. So this time it's a new district, and I would say a vastly different district, both in terms of geography, but also in terms of politics. I think, Alex, people are describing this as one of the closest toss-up districts in the country. Probably we'll see where everyone else lands on redistricting, but it looks like many states are moving to more polarized districts. Oregon actually moved to more competitive districts, and this, I think, is the most competitive of the three competitive districts, the new 5th congressional district. So we know that Congressman Kurt Schrader is running for re-election in the district. Jamie McLeod Skinner is running to his left in that primary election. And in your election, you have you, as well as former mayor of Happy Valley, Lori Chavez DeRemer. So we'll get into this race a little bit, but first, why did you decide to run again? Clearly the experience wasn't terrible enough to not give it one more shot, but why did you feel like it was important for you to step forward and run in this election?
Great question. To be very frank with you, I didn't think I'd have another opportunity to run.
Ever?
No, I'm not saying ever, but so quickly in a congressional race, right? Because the original maps, I don't know if you remember, but Earl Blumenauer's district actually wrapped down, I believe, through Hood River and into Bend.
Oh, I don't remember that. Okay.
Yeah, so that was the original map before the walkout happened. So, you're looking at that map and you're just saying, okay, well, that's, it would be like me running against you in Tigard, right? So
bring it on, Jimmy.
Well, I do have a little history in Tigard. I don't know.
Oh, really?
You probably don't know this about me, but I used to deliver meals for Meals on Wheels. And
kidding.
I delivered out of the Tigard Center. And I think on your podcast, what was the name of the building? The Riverwood Heights? Was that the one that you were discussing that was being...
Woodspring tenants, the Woodspring apartments.
Yes, the Woodspring apartments. I used to deliver there.
No,
so it wasn't on my route necessarily, but when I would miss my route because I'd be traveling, I would do a makeup route and I would actually go to that building. So I'm aware of that building. So there were certain issues that I couldn't talk about in the last campaign, and i.e. delivering for Meals on Wheels, right? Which I had a weekly route for 6 or 7 years. I think I delivered over 5,000 meals.
Wow.
I delivered in the Tigard area for a while, and then I actually delivered in downtown Portland when my office moved to Old Town. And I delivered to Bud Clark Commons, which I don't know if you guys know where that building is, but it's right across from the train station. And that is one of the grittiest parts of Portland. And, being involved in the community was super important to me. I was on a couple of other nonprofits that I don't think people really recognize how important these are to the local economy. I was asked to join the board of the ballet, for instance. And the reason I was asked was because they needed financial help because they were about to go bankrupt. And I didn't know the first thing about ballet, But what I was told was there were 250 full and part-time jobs that were at risk if the valley went under. And the economic impact on the city would have been incredible. Now, these were issues that I wasn't able to talk about in my last congressional race because my Achilles was that I was this Portland guy. And and the animosity of Eastern Oregon towards the Valley is incredible. Even though I spent most of my summers and in the second district, it didn't matter. So this district, the new district, gives me this incredible opportunity where I can talk about all this work I did in the community. My childhood home is in this district. My parents still live in this district. I played Little League baseball in this district. So that attack on me will no longer be relevant. So I'm excited to run. And yes, this is a very different race. This race is going to be potentially a $3 to $5 million race, which is incredibly expensive for a congressional race. But the Portland media market is really expensive. And this is a race where both sides are going to need candidates that can be well funded on a national level and can really put forward the argument they're the best ones to go to Congress.
So real quick follow-up on this race in particular, and then we've got several federal policy issues we want to talk about. So Kurt Schrader has earned the disdain of much of the left because he's perceived as moderate to conservative. He votes no on some important pieces of legislation to the left. He voted against Nancy Pelosi for speaker. And he sort of earned this reputation as I think people who like him would call him a maverick, and people who don't like him would call him like a conservative Democrat, blue dog Democrat, whatever, which I think I don't think he's chair anymore, but he used to be chair. So as a Republican, why run against Kurt Schrader? If Kurt Schrader is one of the few members of the Democratic caucus who is broadly, or at least more aligned with you than the rest of the caucus, help maybe bring you in a different direction, why run against him?
I mean, doesn't his voting record say that he votes with Nancy Pelosi 80% of the time?
I guess the 20% is the
well, and that maybe that's the problem with politics in America, right? He's looked on as this evil person on the left because he goes against Nancy Pelosi 20% of the time. I look at him and I say, well, 80% of the time he is with Nancy Pelosi. So there are certain issues where I look at Nancy Pelosi's agenda and I just say, I don't think that this is the best path for America. I'm looking at 6.9% inflation, and that is scary. And so, we are younger, so we're lucky. So we don't remember what it was like in the 80s. But to give you an example, in Deschutes County, when my parents built the house on our farm in '83, there were only 5 housing building permits issued that entire year in Deschutes County. So that's what
hard to imagine.
Yeah. It's incredible, right? But that's what inflation does. Inflation. Now, I'm not saying we're going to go to 14% interest rates or whatever Volcker jacked them up to. But, this is something that younger people don't appreciate how dangerous inflation is. And once inflation starts rolling, it's really scary. So yes, I get it that he doesn't pass that test, the purity test on the left. And that's why you have someone coming from his left in the primary. And, and this is also something that's a problem with the House of Representatives in general, right? 20 years ago, you probably had 180 districts. Maybe it was 150. You're gonna have to give me a little leeway. Don't hold me to these numbers. I think it was maybe 150 districts that could flip between Democrat and Republican in every race. And I think we're down to 80 at this point. And
that's probably a generous definition of flippable. Like it's a really small number.
So basically we're talking about 350 districts where, someone like Earl Blumenauer, he's not worried about the Republican. He's worried about getting attacked from the left. Like Cliff Bentz, he's not worried about the Democrat. He's worried about getting attacked from the right. So, these are things that that the country has to deal with, and unfortunately, this polarization, that's part of the reason for it.
Yeah, and Jimmy, this dives a little bit into the policy. Before we dive, because I do want to ask you a question about inflation and tariffs as well. In terms of like policy, flippable districts, swing districts, and all that stuff, I just want to quickly read, and I think I found this on your Twitter page, but your bio from last time. Maybe this is one of your ads. It says, "I'm a gun packing, Trump backing, send them packing conservative. Oregonians deserve a voice in DC who will stand tall for our values and not concede anything to the radical socialists." First of all, I love all of those things. We could only send Ben packing and Tiger. That would really put the cherry on top of it.
Titus was the target audience for that ad, and it landed.
I saw it on. It was a beautiful Facebook ad. I saw it. But I did just want to ask, right? You obviously ran in a very conservative district before. You have to highlight, specifically issues that were going to appeal to mostly conservative primary voters, because, of course, whoever would have run against you, ran against Cliff Bentz, ran against Knute Buehler, they would have lost dramatically. And the person did lose dramatically, probably by like 15 or 20 points. I don't remember the exact total.
I think it was like 25.
Okay, so even worse margin than that. Yeah. In terms of this district, right, it's like a swingy district. You're going to have to appeal to a lot more of diverse range of audience, right? You have really conservative rural voters, and then also really progressive voters in cities. And then you have moderate suburban voters. Right. What are the sort of issues that you want to define your and I do want to ask you this too, because COVID's coming back. Hopefully that won't drown out every campaign issue. But what are the types of issues that you want to define your campaign this time around with this new district?
Yeah, I think that some critical issues are relevant from my last race to this race. I think the timber issue is a critical one. And it's a little bit like divesting from the oil markets. The timber business was, when I was a kid in Oregon, we had 85,000 timber workers, right? These were working, hardworking, blue-collar jobs, living wage salaries that didn't require a higher degree. And unfortunately, that number has come from 85,000 to 25,000. So I think that is really important. And, the environmentalists have been highly effective at blocking our use of federally managed lands. We used to get 50% of our timber from the federal lands. That number is down to 10% at this point. Right. So that is something that, in my opinion, it was a critical mistake. And especially if you go and ask the environmentalists, you put them on truth serum and you say, okay, was this really a good policy? Because at the end of the day, we hurt 60,000 blue collar workers by eliminating those jobs. And if you look at a lot of the towns in the district, especially over the San Diego Pass, unfortunately, these towns remind me a lot of what happened at Pittsburgh. Basically, in the early 80s, Pittsburgh lost 25% of its population in 2 years when the steel industry shut down. Now, that was more economic driven. The timber industry was more of a government shutdown, right? But because there was small towns, the impact was felt a lot slower. It didn't get the same media attention. And unfortunately, what you see now are these incredible forest fires, right? Because the private industry is no longer responsible for the federally managed lands. You are now seeing, we had a 400,000 acre fire in Southern Oregon this year. The air quality in Bend this summer was ranked last in the world. I mean, that is something that is devastating. And so people want to talk about, we need to, stop with hydrocarbons. Unfortunately, 99% of our vehicles are gas vehicles and only 1% are electric. You want to actually make a dent on hydrocarbons in Oregon, you got to stop the forest fires, because that has a devastating impact on people's health, right? older citizens, it affects the most, and pregnant women. I mean, those are two people that we should be protecting at all costs, in my opinion. And the other devastating thing that happens with the forest fires is that you have the tourist season is the summer in Oregon, right? And if you are in Oregon this summer or over the last 10 summers, and you happen to come across a fire, you're going back to wherever you came from, and you tell everyone, don't go take a trip to Oregon. And that is really bad for the local economy. So I think that timber is going to be another issue, and that is a federal issue at the end of the day. And it's really sad that we have not taken responsibility for the fires. If you want to help out the environment, your number one job in Oregon should be shutting down forest fires.
So I think you will hear some alignment on that question with some with Democrats in the legislature, although maybe a different approach. My final question before Alex takes us back to wonky land is on race, and I think this congressional district will probably have significantly more racial diversity than the second congressional district, although maybe not. There's certainly the general election in the 6th than the primary election in the 2nd, if it goes that way. And we've talked to a lot of our guests about 2020 being the year, in addition to the COVID side of things, it was also this racial awakening. And so I guess I'm curious from you, what as a Republican candidate, a political party who notoriously has performed poorly with voters of color, communities of color, what would be your approach to try to win the support of the Latino population in Oregon, which is growing, the Asian American population, and other communities of color?
It's a great question. Yeah, I do believe that the 5th district, don't hold me to this, is I think 10% is Latino. I think it's the numbers are very low in the other racial minorities, but I think that that Latinos care deeply about this country, and I think there's actually a lot of alignment. And I think you've actually seen kind of the swing back to the Republican Party that we had, maybe 20 years ago under George W. Bush. The percentages are going up. If you look at the percentage of now, obviously, Latinos come from a lot of different backgrounds, but just if you look at just Mexican Americans, first generation men, I believe 73% of them are in the workforce, which is an incredibly high level. I think it's only 65% for white men. So, I mean, this is a population that cares about the economy, that cares deeply about taxes, and that cares deeply about education, and that cares deeply about inflation, right? Because when you are trying to raise your family and bring them up, higher education is critical, right? You want the next generation to be able to go to college, and being able to pay for eggs, which are up 30% year over year, steak, or beef in general, up 30%. I mean, these are numbers that are really shocking. And unfortunately, these bread and butter issues are really hurting Americans because of the inflation issues. They're hurting the population that lives paycheck to paycheck much more than people who are much wealthier. So I think that you can talk just about job creation and keeping the federal government and taxes lower. I think that these are important issues, and I do believe that higher education is important. And I think they're critical to these populations.
Thank you.
Great. And Jimmy, I will just ask you one policy question, one quick question, and then we'll close. In terms of, you talked a lot about inflation. I think you've mentioned it 3 or 4 times. Just kind of curious, both from your professional background in finance, plus you're clearly paying, I think, much closer attention to the sort of economics behind these issues than your average congressional candidate. What do you see as like because there's a lot of debate in terms of what the primary cause of inflation is. Some people say Joe Biden's spending too much money. Other people say the Federal Reserve needs to raise their rates. Other people say no, we just need the, docks or the ports to work harder in Los Angeles, because I guess they weren't running 24 hours a day at some point, which is shocking to me that was something that happened at one point. What do you sort of contribute the cause of inflation to be, and what would basically you want to do in Congress to help address it?
Boy, wouldn't it nice we have Port of Portland right now with all these ships sitting out there in Los Angeles. Yeah, inflation is a serious issue, and I do believe that the federal government has an outsized influence on it. There are a lot of economists on the left that would argue that this is a global phenomenon. And if you look at throughput, in the ports in America, in the spring, it was up 16% year over year. So think about that number. That is a huge leap. And you compare that with the European Union, which is another massive economy in the world. They were roughly 1%. So think about the difference. Think about the amount of goods that are coming into the country through our ports. The inflation is bound to happen, right? When the federal government decides to spend trillions of dollars, right? I mean, and this is happening with, and it is in combination with the Fed as well, because the Fed has had a huge buying program, which they are slowly tapering, thankfully. But unfortunately, it does. The burden does lie with the Biden administration. I think that they took a look at the numbers and they decided to pass a couple of these bills, which are adding greatly to the inflationary numbers. And I think if you look at the raw numbers, it's hard to not argue with that statement.
Gotcha. And now a very unserious question. I will say, when you
rigid drop off there, Alex.
Yeah, this is a rigid drop off. And you have to promise to be honest when you answer this question.
Oh boy.
You have to be very honest. When I first saw your campaign video, I actually laughed out loud because it was so genius. Who invented the Trumpbacker nickname? Was that you? Was that your campaign director? Was that a consultant? It still literally pops in my head. Like when I was telling someone you were coming on our podcast, and I literally called you Jimmy Trumpacker. So the marketing really gimmicks are working very well.
So, as you could imagine, my name can be transferred to a lot of different things. Not all of them very flattering. So, it was basically a combination of, I sat down with our ad people and I said, listen, my name is very, I don't want to say it's strange. It's just, it's abnormal, right? And it's actually, it's a totally American name. This was not the name that was that we had brought over when we came to America. They actually shockingly tried to Americanize it, if you can believe that. And so, like, in my head, I'm like, okay, what are we thinking? We're thinking Smith, Johnson, or Crumpacker. Like, what sounds more American? So they went with Crumpacker, which is but I am very proud of my forebears and of the people who have come before me, and I do love the name, and it does lends itself to humor. So
there was an Oregon, I think it was a congressman with the last name Crumpacker. Is that the same family, or is that a different?
Yeah, that's my great grandfather. Yeah.
No kidding. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's part of the deep roots in Oregon.
Yeah. No, I mean, 7 generations. You've been around for a while. So yeah. So he was, and that was certainly someone that you have to admire as a young kid. And when I was studying politics at Georgetown, I was it was kind of in the back of my mind that if the opportunity ever presented itself and I was ever blessed enough, to go back and represent what I believe is the greatest people in the greatest state in the union. And, unfortunately, and as you guys have discussed on this podcast many times, we do have a lot of issues that need to be dealt with, but I see unlimited potential in this state. And I think it's, we just need good leaders to step up and help try and take us there.
Great place to end it, Alex.
Yeah, well, great. Well, Jimmy, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on and talk about a wide range of issues. Before we let you go, where can people follow your work? Where can they find more information about your campaign? Where can they go to donate or volunteer or endorse you? Where can they go to find all things Jimmy?
Sure. So Facebook is obviously a great place. Jimmy Crumpacker for Congress. You can find it on there. And if you want to donate, you can go to WinRed. I'm sure Ben is jumping on right now.
I have WinRed blocked. If you have an ActBlue link, we can talk. But
so Ben, if you donate on WinRed, I will write you a 5-star review, which all of your audience needs to do.
This is clear extortion.
Well, Jimmy, thank you again for coming on. I really enjoyed the conversation, and we hope we can have you back again.
Yeah, guys, I really appreciate it. And, I think there are a lot of areas that we didn't touch on, which would be fun to talk about in the future. So thanks a lot. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you at the next episode.